Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're glad you could join us today. Welcome to another webinar hosted by thinc, the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. In today's webinar, we're glad to collaborate with the organization UKLFI, UK Lawyers for Israel, with whom we've been collaborating for many years. We invite you to join us on our monthly webinar, the last Tuesday of every month throughout the entire year. On today's session, our distinguished guests are Andrew Tucker, Director General of thinc, Professor Steve Zipperstein from UCLA, and Jonathan Turner from UKLFI. UKLFI Charitable Trust is a UK charity set up to advance legal education in Israel and anti-Semitism and to provide legal support to victims of anti-Semitism, particularly anti-Semitism which manifests itself with regard to Israel. For the new joiners, welcome. thinc stands for the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation and is a global network of international law academics, practitioners, and experts in related disciplines. thinc was founded in 2017 in The Hague, the global capital of international law, and we challenge the misuse of international law to delegitimize the State of Israel and advocate international law for peace and security between Israel and her neighbors. International law is a major weapon, as you know, used by Israel's adversaries, and misuse of it is an existential threat to the Jewish state. We achieve our mission through research, education, and advocacy. Thank you for joining us today. Our moderator today in every webinar is thinc Director Andrew Tucker. So, let's begin. Hi, Andrew.
Hello, Sylvie. Thank you so much. Well, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to jump in today to talk about the proceedings currently happening before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. The International Court of Justice is the World Court. It's the highest judicial organ within the UN system. It was created in 1945 with the creation of the United Nations to do two things: to resolve disputes between states and to give advice to UN organs on the performance of their functions. It consists of 15 judges. The court has a lot of cases before it. It's situated here in The Hague, in the Netherlands, in the Peace Palace, a beautiful building that was built before the First World War as a place where justice would be done. There are actually three cases currently before the court concerning Israel and Palestine. The first is a case brought by Palestine against the United States for the moving of the US embassy to Jerusalem several years ago. The case is kind of dormant at the moment, nothing really happening. The US denies the court has jurisdiction. The second one we've seen very prominently recently, the case brought by South Africa against Israel, claiming Israel's committing genocide against the Palestinians. We had preliminary proceedings, preliminary measures recently, and the court is now looking at the merits of that case. It will take a long time. The third case is the subject of today's webinar. That is the application by the by the General Assembly to the court in December 2022, asking the court for an advisory opinion on a specific question that the General Assembly formulated in a resolution 77/247. We're going to talk about that. A very controversial resolution because it was only passed by 87 member states. That's less than half the number of UN member states. A lot of states opposed it or abstained from voting because they were not in favor of it. And yet the resolution was adopted and the question has been put to the court, and the court now has to answer that question or decide whether it's going to answer that question. And the question is as follows. And I'll read it out because it's important, I think, just to get the context. The question is in two parts. A, what are the legal consequences arising from the ongoing violation by Israel of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, comma, from its prolonged occupation, settlement, and annexation of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the holy city of Jerusalem, and from its adoption of related discriminatory legislation and measures. That's one question. The second question is, how do the policies and practices of Israel referred to above affect the legal status of the occupation, and what are the legal consequences that arise for all states and the United Nations from this status? Okay, so this question, they're looking at a whole range of issues related to the Israel-Palestine conflict or dispute, whatever you want to call it, Israeli-Arab conflict. And they're all bundled into this question, and the court is asked to assume a number of things. First, it's asked to assume that Israel is violating the Palestinian right to self-determination. It's asked to assume that the occupation is prolonged, that there is settlement, annexation, and occupation of Palestinian territory. So a lot of issues here. And then it's asking the court, what are the legal consequences of that occupation? In a moment, we'll see that the sponsors of this resolution, which is primarily the Palestinians together with the Islamic and the Arab states, who are very prominent, are pushing for something very specific. Namely, they want Israel's occupation, its very existence in these occupied territories, to be declared illegal, and Israel to be ordered effectively to withdraw completely in terms of its military and citizens from every inch of those territories immediately, unconditionally, and completely, are the words of the Palestinian delegation. So let me just share a couple of impressions with you of this past week. We had the privilege of being in court. The court has, and I'll just go back here, hang on a moment, sorry, go back to the beginning. The court has just completed 6 days of oral proceedings. 52 member states plus 3 international organizations appeared before the court over the course of 6 days to present their what they think about these questions that the court is being asked. And they were full days. Every day from morning till the end of the afternoon, the court was presented with these presentations. The starting off was the Palestinians. This is the leader of the Palestinian legal delegation, that is Philippe Sands, a very well-known British professor and barrister, very prominent, and he spoke very eloquently on behalf of Palestine and demanded that the court make an advice that the occupation is absolutely and utterly illegal. Israel has no right whatsoever to be in these territories, and they demand the Palestinians' full and complete and unconditional and immediate withdrawal from the territories in order that the Palestinians can fully exercise their right to self-determination. So they placed this claim very much in terms of the right to self-determination. The Palestinians have been denied this right for 100 years, and the time has come for the court to decide completely that this needs to be remedied, and the Palestinians need to be able to have the freedom to decide how they want to live, where they want to live, and whether they want a state. They say they demand a state on these territories. So that was the claim. They had 3 hours, Palestine, to present their case. They had several speakers, some of them being leaders of the Palestinian government, which 2 days ago resigned. So they're no longer in a position of authority. This just all came up in the last days. This is the Palestinian leader of the Palestinian delegation who opened and closed their submissions. It was very emotional. This is the leader of the Hungarian legal delegation who put the case that since the 7th of October, this is not the right moment for the court to be making a submission. This is the leader of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and I'm just highlighting some of the presentations. You can imagine a lot of them, but these three international organizations were very centrally prominent. And the OIC represents 57 member states, so they put their case very much in terms of Islamic Arab sovereignty over Al-Quds, and particularly the Temple Mount. But all of Jerusalem, they're claiming, is Arab Islamic territory, and they say that's part of the OIC Charter, is the striving for the liberation of Palestine and particularly Jerusalem. Lastly, we had the Fiji delegation. We were privileged to be able to support, made a plea for the court not to issue an advisory opinion on several grounds. One of them being that the court, first of all, we say there are Oslo agreements, there is a peace process that has been agreed, both in the Oslo agreements between Israel and the PLO and sanctioned by the Security Council and the General Assembly. They all say that the only way to resolve the dispute is through negotiations and an agreement, and not through bypassing this process through legal proceedings. And the second argument was that the court, because these questions are very one-sided, they only look at Israel's position, they only look at Israel's violations of international law. The court's only looking at one half of the issues, and it's ignoring Israel's position, it's ignoring the PLO's own responsibilities and possible violations of international law. And that's one-sided, and the court doesn't have the evidence before it that it would need in order to make a judicial finding. They were the arguments of Fiji. So without further ado, I'd like to sort of open up the discussion now to our guests, and I'm very thankful to have Jonathan and Steve with us and to share your perspectives on all of this. We'll get into the legal issues, I think, as we go along. There are a number of legal claims that are raised, and I think the fundamental one is that the Palestinians, the territory of Palestine belongs to the Palestinians. And the idea of a Jewish homeland is illegitimate. Palestinians said this, the Arabs said it, the Islamic Cooperation said it, many other states said it. So that the mandate, as far as it included a right of the Jews to return and to establish a homeland, was in contravention of the covenant of the League of Nations. So even the creation of the State of Israel is problematic. The War of 48 was problematic. It's all Israel's fault. So that by the time you get to 67 and post-67, Israel is occupying territory that already was Palestinian for a long time. Now, that raises a whole bunch of issues. And another reasonably novel thing is the idea that occupation itself is illegal. And they tried to present the legal case for saying that this occupation, by definition, is illegal because, in fact, what Israel is doing is annexing Palestinian territory, and you're not allowed to annex territory by the use of force. So Israel's only there through self-defense. You cannot use the right to self-defense to claim and annex territory that belongs to another state or other entity. Okay, so without further additions, Jonathan, I'd like to turn to you. Can you help us unpack this advisory opinion process? What is an advisory opinion, and does this one differ from the one we had 20 years ago on the security barrier, the so-called wall advisory opinion? Is this just a repeat, or do you see this one as being different?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and Think for inviting me to participate in this webinar. And it's great to be with Steve again. I look forward to an informative discussion. And thank you to the audience as well, and hello to you all wherever you are. Now, Andrew, as you've mentioned, the International Court of Justice, which incidentally is a different court to the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice has two distinct jurisdictions. It has a jurisdiction to determine disputes between states, or sometimes between states and international organizations. And its decisions on those disputes, so-called contentious cases, are normally binding. There may be problems with how to enforce them because there isn't any clear mechanism. It doesn't have the power to enforce them. It can't send in police to a state to force a state to comply, but they are regarded as binding under international law. The second jurisdiction is to give an advisory opinion to various UN bodies, including the United Nations General Assembly. And these advisory opinions are in theory not binding. They are simply advice to the UN body as to what the law is in the conclusion of the International Court of Justice. Having said that, though, they are in practice treated and assumed to be correct. This is the problem, really, because they increasingly discuss facts and ask questions which raise issues of fact and set out legal conclusions with regard to those facts, regarding the application of the law to those facts. The problem is that the facts which the court is presented with may not be the true facts. And this is certainly a problem with the present opinion, where the United Nations has provided it with 30,000 pages of documents produced by the United Nations, published by them since 1967, none published by the United Nations before 1967, so ignoring key parts of the history which are very important. And then the documents produced by the United Nations include a mass of reports by hostile fact-finding missions and so forth that contain a whole series of inaccuracies and assumptions that are driven by hostility towards Israel. We saw this actually with the earlier opinion that you mentioned 20 years ago concerning the security barrier constructed by Israel in and around the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. The International Court received a rather smaller volume of documentation in that case. The issue was a narrower one anyway, but the documentation was smaller, but it was wrong. We know that it was very clearly wrong because the Israeli Supreme Court subsequently had to consider the same issues concerning the security barrier. It had considered them already in one case, several cases, and then it considered them again following the International Court's judgment in the Alfei Menashe case. And there was a superb judgment by Justice Akram Barak, who was then president of the Israel Supreme Court, in which he showed that the facts on which the International Court had relied and based its conclusion were to a very large extent wrong, and where they weren't wrong, they were very much one-sided. There were quite extraordinary things. They said the International Court had observed that there had been a significant reduction in the number of patients treated at the UN hospital in Calkilia. And they assumed that this, and the report on which they relied, said that this was because of the impact of the security barrier stopping people getting into Calkilia. But in fact, the true position was that 2 new hospitals have just been opened up in Calkilia. So actually, it was a good news story that healthcare was getting better in Calkilia. There were more hospital beds and temporary surplus of capacity. And not surprisingly, the number of patients at the UN hospital had gone down. And this situation of the assumption being made that Israel must be at fault if you observe something that might be a misfortune, that therefore it must be down to those Zionists are responsible. You see this pervasively in the UN documents. And despite all this judgment of the International Court of Justice, despite it being exposed by the Israeli Supreme Court as being based on false information, it has been cited repeatedly by the countries that have made submissions to the International Court in the current case.
Okay, Jonathan, I'm going to interrupt you there. So you're suggesting that there's a hostile element within the United Nations that's deliberately presenting false information, right? We might come back to that, because that's quite a claim, of course, that you know, because I think many people would say the UN is there to do fact-finding and to find out the real information. If the court can't rely on the UN, then who can the court rely on?
Yes, I didn't say it was necessarily deliberate. I think they start with an assumption that Israel is to blame.
Okay.
Rather,
well, let's come back to that. I first want to hear from Steve. Steve.
Yes, I'm sorry, I've taken that time.
No, that's all right. But you've raised a very important point, and we'll come back to it, about the question of facts, and who decides what is truth and what isn't truth. Steve, can you give us a bit of a steer? What do you think is happening here in this case? And do you think it's important in some way? Do you think it's a significant case that we should be aware of? And what are the issues that you would say are problematic or important?
Well, thank you, Andrew. And Jonathan, it's a pleasure to be with both of you and your wonderful audience again. Let me just make a couple of observations. First of all, yes, this is a very, very, very important case with great significance for Israel, and I would suggest for the international community as a whole. We are seeing something very, very disturbing, quite frankly, happening with this case. You read the 2 questions that the General Assembly asked the International Court of Justice to provide advice to the General Assembly about. But it is also important to note that the resolution that the General Assembly passed, those 57 countries, prior to those 2 questions, you have about 9.5 pages of single-spaced accusatory rhetoric against Israel, reading more like an indictment or an accusation than a genuine good faith statement from the General Assembly to the court saying, look, here's an important issue. We're not sure what the law is. Can you please advise us, the General Assembly, so that we can take appropriate action? And instead, what we have is a charge sheet, a lengthy one, where the General Assembly is saying to the court, Israel is guilty of denying the Palestinians their right to self-determination, of engaging in a prolonged occupation, of annexation of territory, and so on and so forth. And so it's not really a request for advice, it's really a request for a punishment. I'm a former federal prosecutor, and when I would make accusations in the form of an indictment, the next step wouldn't be for me to go to the judge and say, okay, what's the punishment? The next step would be for the judge to say to me, okay, you now have to come to court with witnesses, with documents, with evidence, admissible evidence, and prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of 12 people. And what the General Assembly is doing here is skipping over all of that, pronouncing Israel guilty and asking the court to impose punishment. And so what we're really seeing here structurally is something very, very disturbing. In the academic literature, we call this sphere transgression. And what the court and the General Assembly are doing is working together in tandem, in concert, to make policy determinations, policy declarations, having really very little to do with the law. The General Assembly and the court working together want to isolate Israel, ostracize Israel, declare Israel to be the new version of apartheid South Africa, to declare that Israel does not deserve a lawful, legitimate place among the nations of the world, and to essentially do to Israel what the Security Council of the United Nations could do if it could muster a unanimous vote to punish Israel. But because of the American veto, and I would say in this case, because of the threat of a potential British veto or a British abstention, but at least the threat of an American veto means that the General Assembly needs the court to do what it otherwise could not do in the Security Council, namely pronounce Israel guilty and impose punishment. Luckily, the court doesn't have any enforcement power, and luckily, an advisory opinion is just that, the rendering of advice on a non-binding basis. But this process of trying to supplant the Security Council is very, very disturbing and should be of great concern to the international community. So this case has repercussions not just for Israel, but for the entire global system.
You're on mute, Andrew.
Just play the devil's advocate here, right? So the problem with the Security Council is you have the veto right. So people will say, well, America's just supporting Israel because America always supports Israel. This was said very often last week, by the way.
Actually, that's not true. December 2016, in the waning days of the Obama administration, the American ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, abstained when Security Council Resolution 2334 came before the Council. That was the resolution that declared Israeli settlements a flagrant violation of international law. So to say the US is always voting for Israel is not a fair statement. But on the issues raised in this advisory opinion request, yes, the US would veto. And so the whole point here is to bypass, circumvent the US veto.
Well, no, and I think people are actually quite open about that now. They say, look, the Security Council is failing in its job because there is this problem. Therefore, the court has to break this stranglehold because justice is being denied. And the Palestinians have a right to a state, and the occupation is impeding that right. That's the basic thesis, okay? You have a peoples have rights to self-determination. They have a right to a state. And Israel, there's no reason why Israel should be occupying. The only reason they're occupying is to prevent the Palestinians from a state. Why is that? What's the problem with that argument?
Jonathan, do you want to take it, or shall I respond quickly in the first instance?
You can respond, Steve. I could add something if I think anything can be added.
Okay. Well, I've written extensively about this, Andrew and Jonathan, as you know. Let me just very quickly provide the answer. It's amazing, as Jonathan was recounting the legal arguments, and you, Andrew, the legal arguments that were made in the court last week, the very same arguments about the covenant of the League of Nations, and all of those arguments the Palestinians made in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s. This is nothing new. This is nothing new. And if we're going to go back to history, then let's begin with the mandate for Palestine, adopted unanimously by the Council of the League of Nations on 24th July 1922 at St. James's Palace in London. The preamble says that the international community recognizes the Jewish people's historic connection to Palestine and their right to, and I quote, reconstitute their national home there. Not constitute, not colonize, but reconstitute. And if we bring that forward during the British mandate, the British supervision, occupation, if you will, of Palestine after World War I between 1917 and 1948. The British government convened various trials, various commissions where we heard these legal arguments that you both referred to that were made last week. And one of those commissions, the Royal Commission in July of 1937, proposed the two-state solution. And if you look at the map, 90% of Palestine would be Arab, and a very small portion in the northwest would be Jewish. The Jews said, we'll consider it. The Arabs, the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, flatly rejected it. And in 1939, the British government in the May 17 white paper offered all of Palestine to the Arabs within 10 years. And the Mufti said no, he wanted it now, immediately. And in 1947, 29 November, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 181. Again, the two-state solution, with a far larger area than the modern-day West Bank and Gaza allocated for the Arab state, the Palestinian state, a smaller area for the Jewish state. The Jews reacted by dancing in the streets of Tel Aviv and celebrating. The Arabs reacted by starting a violent war the next day. The war was joined by all the surrounding Arab countries when Israel declared independence on 14 May 1948. And then in December 1948, the Palestinians gathered in Jericho and demanded what? Not statehood in the West Bank and Gaza. They requested Jordan to annex the West Bank, which Jordan did. And for the next 17, 18 years, between 1948 and 1967, the West Bank and East Jerusalem were Jordanian, not Palestinian. And in May of 1964, when they formed the PLO, the Palestinians, meeting at the Intercontinental Hotel in Jerusalem, adopted their original covenant. And Article 24 of the original covenant of the PLO says very clearly, we do not assert sovereignty over the West Bank, which belongs to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, nor do we assert sovereignty over the Gaza Strip. Why? Because the Palestine that the PLO wanted to liberate was the then state of Israel within its 1967, pre-1967 borders. And so we go on and on and on and on throughout history, where the Palestinians are repeatedly offered a state, and they repeatedly reject the offer, over and over and over and over again. That is not anyone denying them self-determination. That is them denying themselves self-determination. That is not a violation of the law by the UK or by Israel or by anyone else. It is a permanent, century-long desire by the Palestinians to deny the Jewish right to reconstitute their national home in Palestine. Jewish self-determination rights are equal to Palestinian self-determination rights. I'll say one more thing, then I'll stop. I am a supporter of the two-state solution. I know not all of you in the audience would agree with me, but I think that you would all agree with me that if the Palestinians want statehood, they have to achieve it through statecraft, diplomacy, and negotiation, and not litigate their way to statehood at the International Court of Justice. They committed to negotiation in the Oslo Accords, 1993 and 1995. And before the ink was dry, they reverted to terrorism and now litigation. Let's go back to diplomacy between the parties. That's the only way that they will and legally should be able to obtain statehood.
Thanks, Steve. Jonathan?
Yes, can I just add a bit more about why it is necessary to resolve these issues by negotiation rather than litigation? And that's because litigation, and people will tell you this in commercial disputes and other disputes as well, is a blunt instrument, and you have very limited options for the solution. So the outcome of litigation, if you adopt some of the Palestinian case, the more moderate version of the Palestinian case, is you divide the city of Jerusalem into two separate bits. You have a border that extends a very long way. You have enormous security problems, particularly in Jerusalem, how you manage to deal with the security there. You have a non-functioning city in which people can't get to places of work, places of worship, places of facilities they need, hospitals. You have university in an isolated area or Mount Scopus. You have absolute chaos unless you can have some sensible negotiation about arrangements. And this would explain why, in a poll conducted at the end of 2021 for a Palestinian news agency, 93% of the Arabs of East Jerusalem, according to the poll, favored a continuation of Israeli rule over the entire city, as compared with the alternative of splitting it into two separate areas. You have this also with all other aspects. The Oslo Accords identified a number of key outstanding issues that needed to be discussed in final status talks, precisely because they were not susceptible of resolution in other ways. A decision by the International Court of Justice, for example, saying that Israel must withdraw all its forces and all its personnel and have no Israelis in both the West Bank and now the Gaza Strip, where, of course, the Israeli army is operating. If it were to do that, if it were to comply with such a ruling, there will be a bloodbath. Hamas has threatened to repeat the 7th of October again and again. If it were able to resume control over the Gaza Strip on the Israeli troops leaving there, it presumably would, and would carry out similar attacks. And from the West Bank, much closer to Israel's main population centers, if Israeli forces were to be withdrawn, it's highly likely that there will be a Hamas takeover there as well. And the security situation would be an absolute disaster. And the very serious casualties that have unfortunately been incurred in recent months in and around the Gaza Strip would be repeated on a much larger scale, I fear, if there were to be an evacuation by Israel of the West Bank. And one can count on such a decision of the
Well, one of the arguments that was made,
Court of Justice not being complied with, because
the counter argument that was made, Jonathan, is that the right to self-determination is a so-called peremptory norm of international law, jus cogens. It's such a fundamental right that you can't derogate from it. And Israel should not be allowed unilaterally to decide what its security needs are in a way that overrides this very, very fundamental human right that goes to the core essence of the identity of these people. And the courts being implored to hear this cry for justice. You know, Steve, going back to your point, they would say, well, you know, the Allied powers in 1920 didn't have the right to take this territory from the Palestinians. Only 10% of them were Jews. Why should the Allies have a right to give the Jews this right? This is, I think, the core of this case.
Yeah, so Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, conquered Palestine in 1517 and occupied it for the next 400 years. And throughout those 400 years, the principle of international law was to the victor goes the spoils. If you conquer territory, you get to keep it. And then along comes World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, and the newly formed League of Nations decides, well, we want to move into a different direction. We no longer believe that might makes right, and if you conquer territory, you get to keep it. Instead, we think that the victors in World War I, who captured territory from Turkey and from Germany around the world, the victorious parties, primarily France and the UK, ought to administer those territories on behalf of the local people until such time as the local people are able to take control of their own destiny and rule themselves. Fair enough. And so they did that for Iraq, and they did that for Lebanon, and they did that for Syria and for various other countries around the world captured from Germany. But when it came to Palestine, the situation was deemed by the international community to be entirely different. First of all, there was no such place as Palestine during the 400 years of Turkish rule. There was never a geographic entity in the Middle East called Palestine. This was an invention of post-World War I map making, really beginning during the war with the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France. And so as to Palestine, the League of Nations said, we're going to treat this area different. Why? Because of the Jewish historical right to return to their national home. You can think of Zionism, Andrew, as the first great national liberation movement of the 20th century. The first great self-determination movement of the 20th century was the movement of the Jewish people globally to return home. And the international community accorded legal recognition to that right in the preamble and in the other language, Article 2, Article 6, Article 14, etc., of the Mandate for Palestine. And so for anyone, again, to say that the land was conquered and taken away from the Palestinians are missing, number one, that point, and number two, missing the point that the land that we're talking about was never land that belonged to the Palestinians as an entity. There's no deed of title to that land. It was Turkish land, and then after World War I, it was administered by Britain on behalf of the local people. And then on 14 May 1948, acting in accordance with Resolution 181 of 29 November 1947, Israel declared independence, as the UN had authorized it to do. And the Palestinian Arabs, unfortunately, chose not to declare their independence in the area allocated to them, but to try to kill all the Jews who were in the area allocated to the Jews by the UN, helped by all the surrounding Arab countries. And so if anyone has a complaint here, it is the Israelis, the Jews, who were merely acting in accordance with the rights conferred on them by the international community, both the League of Nations in 1922 and the United Nations in November 1947.
Well, I suppose say the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. You know, if the international community can give it, they can also take it away. I think just to push back, I mean, I think the response to that is that the League of Nations covenant was intended to give a kind of self-determination right to the population of the territories that the Allies conquered. And the population were mainly non-Jews. I think this is the core of their argument. So
yeah, it's the same argument they made in 1929 before the Shaw Commission, 1930 before the Hoffman Commission.
And they're coming up with the same.
The argument is based on a reading of Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations that refers to certain peoples formerly living under Turkish rule and so forth. And I mean, that was litigated extensively in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and every single court that looked at that, courts, by the way, comprised of British judges, Dutch, Swiss, Swedish, Australian, Canadian, Guatemalan judges rejected that argument because the language, and I can get into the details if you want, it's quite technical, but the language of Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations does not support the Palestinian reading. And it's amazing that here they are in the third decade of the 21st century, re-arguing and plowing back over that same ground that they lost over and over again. What's different now compared to 100 years ago, 80 years ago? What's different? Unfortunately, the deck is stacked completely against Israel at the General Assembly and the International Court of Justice. That's what is different, and that's why this case is so dangerous.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And if I can put, so as well as the wording of the Covenant of the League of Nations to which Steve refers, I'd also put it in a broader context. At the end of the First World War, the Middle East Empire of the Turks, of the Ottoman Turks, was liberated from their rule. 97% of it was allocated to the creation of new Arab states. And a tiny sliver of land was allocated for the reconstitution of the Jewish national home, to enable the long dispossessed Jewish people to have a national territory of their own in their ancient homeland. And that was seen as fair and just overall at the time. It offered those Arabs living in Palestine, and it was a relatively small population in a rather desolate backwater of the Turkish Empire at that time. It had improved somewhat since the mid-19th century when it had been really desolate, but it was still an impoverished area where malaria was rife until the Jewish settler Kliegler managed to find a solution to it. So it offered the Arabs of Palestine the chance to work with the Zionists to improve the area. And that actually happened. There was a massive increase in prosperity in the population, improvement of the area. And at the time, this was the outcome of the negotiations at Versailles and then at San Remo, was seen as a triumph for not only the Jews, but also for the Arabs. And they congratulated themselves. There was a big dinner in San Remo at which they shared a table and were busily toasting each other with their success in persuading the successful Western allies that they got what they wanted. They got independence for their, or a promise of independence in future for their peoples. And I think the situation does need to be seen in that context. And I would actually also like to say something about picking up this point about the deck that's stacked against us now, against Israel. There is a very real problem. You have the 57 members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and their allies have an absolute majority in the United Nations, and they have used this really to undermine Israel at every opportunity. And Israel's position was made all the weaker by the illegal use of the regional groups system, which governs business in the United Nations. Many of the positions are filled on a geographically equitable basis. That being something that there was a resolution requiring that, and it was implemented by establishing regional groups. But for many years, Israel was not allowed to participate in these regional groups. So it wasn't allowed by the Arab states to participate in the Asian group. Since it wasn't in Europe, it couldn't be in the European group, or either of the European groups, West European or East European. And it was left out in the cold without the ability to form alliances and establish voting patterns on different things and different turns in the machinery of the United Nations, because you have one country's turn, then another country's turn for this post, that post, the other post. Israel was frozen out of this until 2000 in New York, until 2014 in Geneva. And this is still actually having its effects because traditional patterns have been cemented, and Israel is sort of like the sort of small different boy on the playground in school, the victim of these gangs ganging up against it.
I'd like to
just quick intervention on self-determination, 30 seconds.
Okay.
Self-determination, not a part of customary international law as of the end of World War II. It's an evolving concept. I would dispute anyone who says that it is now part of jus cogens, erga omnes, etc. And Exhibit A are the Kurdish people. The same people in court last week in The Hague arguing in favor of Palestinian self-determination have done everything they can to deny the same right they claim is so sacred to the Kurdish people.
Okay.
And don't forget
I want to
that,
move on to the West Bank, because let's assume, okay, Israel has a right to exist, Jewish people have a right to homeland, and so forth. The next question is, why is Israel in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and why is it not illegal? What is this is the core issue I think the court's grappling with. What is the justification for Israel being militarily or civilian? Settlements was a constant issue of discussion last week. Settlements are being implanted there by the Israeli government, placing Israelis there in order to claim dominion over this territory. And I think there's a lack of understanding about, in the first place, why after 1967, we know that obviously Israel took control during the course of the Six-Day War. Why did Israel not simply give back the territories, but claim the right to have an occupation in the West Bank and to claim sovereignty over East Jerusalem?
2 points. A, if you were to go and do a title search for the West Bank and East Jerusalem, who owns it? Who owns it? And as I said earlier, Turkey owned it for 400 years. Then World War I came along. Turkey was conquered, ousted from the Middle East, or Turkish rule in the Middle East was conquered, ended. And after 1917, nobody owned the West Bank. Nobody owned East Jerusalem. To this day, as we're sitting here right now, nobody owns the West Bank. Nobody holds a clear and convincing claim of legal title to the West Bank or to East Jerusalem. And so in 1967, when Egypt and Syria were threatening to destroy Israel, and Israel begged King Hussein not to join the coming war, and King Hussein ignored those warnings and launched Jordanian aircraft into Israel and started shelling West Jerusalem. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, Israel lawfully invoked its right to self-defense, particularly as to Jordan, because Israel did not preemptively attack Jordan as it did Egypt. Jordan attacked first. Israel had every right to respond. And it did. And within a few short days, the Jordanian army in the West Bank collapsed. Jordan withdrew from the West Bank and East Jerusalem, leaving Israel in control. Now, what does that mean? When you take over land that doesn't belong to anybody, does it automatically become yours? No, not necessarily. Is it illegal to be there? Absolutely, it is legal. It is not illegal. Why? Because the Hague regulations of 1907 say that occupation following a legitimate act of self-defense is completely legal. There's no time limit. The only obligation on the occupant is not to make an irrevocable change to the status quo. Okay, fine. What about the settlements? The Geneva Conventions of 1949 say you can't deport your people into occupied territory or deport the occupied people out. Well, Israel didn't deport its population into the West Bank. People came from Israel into land that was not owned, theoretically, by any other country, bought land, and built. And in 1995, in the Oslo II agreement, the interim agreement, which the Palestinians negotiated very robustly and very vigorously, and if you don't believe me, read Abu Mazen's book about this. In 1995, the Palestinians agreed in writing that until such time as a permanent peace agreement were to be negotiated, the final status agreement that Jonathan referred to, until such time, for the interim, for the time being, the occupation can remain. The West Bank divided into 3 zones, A, B, and C. C is where the settlements are, and the Palestinians agreed Israel would continue to control Area C, and the settlements could stay put until such time as a final deal was made. The Palestinians agreed to this, negotiated for this. And so the situation in the West Bank today merely reflects that which the Palestinians bargained for in the 1995 interim agreement. Now, it's taken longer to reach a final deal than anyone thought, but that doesn't in any way, shape, or form undermine the legality of Israel's presence in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, because the Palestinians agreed in writing that Israel could remain in place in East Jerusalem and the West Bank until a final status agreement were to be signed. And for the International Court of Justice to ignore that, as pointed out in the British submission and in the Israeli submission, is shocking. That's why I say this is not really a court anymore. It's a policy-making body acting collusively with the General Assembly to circumvent the American veto in the Security Council. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Listen, there's so much more we could talk about. We're going to go into the Q&A. A lot of questions coming in. People have comments, questions. Sylvia, would you please moderate us through the Q&A?
Sure, of course. Thank you, gentlemen, for very interesting points made today. There are many interesting questions. So we'll start with one that says, would negotiating a two-state solution perhaps be a soft power action in part of Israel, giving way to give liberty to prove their inability to constitute a state?
Could you maybe repeat that question, Sylvia? I'm not sure I understood it.
Would negotiating a two-state solution perhaps be a soft power action in part of Israel, on the side of Israel, giving way to give liberty to prove their inability to constitute a state of the Palestinians, I suppose they mean?
It's a very unclear question.
I think I understand what they're getting at. They're saying, why not let them have their state and show how incompetent they are, and how they'll prefer to sort of hand it back afterwards. But the point is that Israel has tried to negotiate a solution over many years, and some progress has been made. It all started back in 1967. The immediate Arab response to Israel's suggestions to resolve matters following the outcome of the Six-Day War was the three no's of the Khartoum Conference: no peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, and no peace. And I can't remember what the third one was now.
No recognition.
No recognition of Israel. Israel held on to the territories at that point primarily for security purposes, to ensure that it couldn't be attacked. Remember, Israel is only 9 miles wide, 15 kilometers wide, if you take out the Judea and Samaria. And the route to Jerusalem from the rest of Israeli territory is only 5 miles wide, 8 kilometers wide. And through between hills on either side, a completely military, virtually indefensible position. The security aspect of it was very important, and has now become again very important, because it's quite clear that unless there are security arrangements in place, giving up or transferring or removing an Israeli military presence from those territories is going to be a disaster, and a disaster for all concerned. But unless you've got a willing partner, you can't just assume that matters will be addressed. It really does need a negotiation, and Israel does do negotiations when the opportunity presents itself, as illustrated by the Abraham Accords. Everyone said,
well, to be honest, the pushback against that, I mean, Netanyahu was quoted continually last week for his statements that he does not support a two-state solution. So this was presented as being Israeli policy is now not to have a two-state solution. I mean, how do we...
Well, Netanyahu is not the only politician in Israel.
Well, he is the prime minister.
He's the prime minister. And this actually also comes back to self-determination, the suggestion that the only outcome of self-determination is an independent state is not actually correct. This has been discussed in pronouncements of courts, as well as academic writing on self-determination. There are a number of different possible solutions that provide self-determination.
I know, but we have 50 years of UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions telling us that the Palestinians have a right to a state. So the court takes these as being some kind of authoritative binding statements of law. Anyway, let's go to the next question. Sylvia, we must have, I think, 1 or 2 more questions.
Yes, we do have many questions. And I think it will be important to go back a little bit to the beginning of the webinar, what we were speaking in the beginning. And this question relates to you, Andrew. If you could share a little bit of your experience in the court during the last week and yesterday. What did you see? What did you feel? What was the sentiment in the court? And if you could speak a little bit about the judges at the ICJ.
Well, it was rather overwhelming kind of experience because, as we've kind of described, 90% of the states and organizations making presentations had really one narrative, and they pushed it very hard. They're all represented by highly qualified, very eloquent, probably very well-paid lawyers who are also academics. I think is another issue that is problematic, probably outside the scope of this webinar, is by academics, you know, if you're pushing the case for the illegitimacy of the mandate for Palestine and the right of the Jewish people as a very political issue, and you're also a legal academic who's supposed to be researching legal history from an academic perspective, those two things seem to me incompatible. Anyway, I find that very difficult. The atmosphere was quite hostile. I think if you were a Jewish or Israeli person in the room, you would have felt very, very isolated and intimidated. And there's an atmosphere of intimidation, which that's my own personal perspective that I felt. I was actually surprised as well at a certain point that there was not a lot of interest. The room was not very full from the second half of the week onwards. I almost got the feeling people were losing interest in it. Very little media attention. In the genocide case, there were massive demonstrations outside the court, particularly on the Palestinians. That wasn't the case this time. So I think people probably don't quite realize what's going on, the significance of it. It's a bit dry, it's a bit academic, it's a bit theoretical. So that was my feeling. Now the judges, there's 15 judges. They are all represent different countries or geographical regions. You know, more or less 50-50 are from Western countries, others from non-Western countries. So on the Western side, you have an American judge recently appointed. You have an Australian judge. You have a Tonka, I think, is Slovakian, if I'm not mistaken. Help me here, correct me if I'm wrong. There's on the other side, you have a South African judge, there's a Brazilian judge, we have a Lebanese judge, we have a Somalia judge. There's a whole range. We do not have a Russian judge until recently. The Russian judge has just left. We have a Chinese judge. There's no British judge anymore at the moment. So it's a real mixture. I suspect at least half of them have already made up their mind well before last week. They kind of know what their position is. They were very attentive during the proceeding. They listened, they wrote notes, but they do not ask any questions, so you really don't get a sense of what they're thinking. So it's very much an unknown quantity.
Thank you. And why did Israel, in your view, in all of your views, why did Israel choose not to put its perspective to the court, given our awareness of the importance of this case in terms of optics for Israel? And how can, let's say, the world learn the truth if Israel or its supporters do not even join the conversation and insist that their position is accurately recorded as part of the international conversation?
I think that's an excellent question. It's a dilemma for Israel. Their sense is if they turn up at a pier, they're going to be regarded as irrelevant anyway. They're lending legitimacy to what is an illegitimate process. They're also, let's face it, understaffed. You know, they had to come up and stand up against the genocide claim. That took a lot of legal resources to mount that case. You can't just suddenly turn around and, you know, run another. They've got limited legal resources as well. I've heard that.
And if I could just jump in here, Andrew, Israel did make an initial filing in the case.
True.
The initial deadline was last July. Then the deadline to respond to the avalanche of filings that were made against Israel was October 25th. Turns out only a couple of weeks after the October 7 massacres. And the court did not even have the decency to extend that deadline. And this is what we're talking about. The court did not have the decency to extend the deadline. And you know, this is reflective of the whole attitude in the UN system, the ICJ, the court, the UN General Assembly, and the UN's handpicked special rapporteur for Palestine, Francesca Albanese, the latest in a long, long line of extraordinarily hostile UN representatives. And just a couple of weeks ago, when French President Macron posted a very sympathetic statement expressing sympathy for the Israeli victims of October 7, she took it upon herself. This is the United Nations, okay? She took it upon herself, Albanese, to say, Macron is saying that this was the greatest anti-Semitic massacre of the 21st century. No, Monsieur Macron, she said, I'm quoting her, the victims of 7 October were not killed because of their Judaism, but in response to Israel's oppression, which France and the international community did nothing to prevent. This is what we are up against. And it is just disgusting.
And I think the resource problem is a real one, because Israel does have to face this. Billions of dollars are spent by the international system in producing propaganda, as it seems to me, at any rate, to undermine Israel, and trying to respond to it all is a monumental task. But they do also feel that they shouldn't give credibility to this process. But I would say that some supporters of Israel, including our organization, have sought to ensure that the court has, if it wishes to avail of it, some material that addresses some of the issues with our rather limited resources. But unfortunately, this court, the International Court of Justice, is rather early 20th century in its modus operandi. They do not like to see NGO submissions. They don't make it easy. NGO submissions don't go on the court file. There is a kind of ambiguous procedure which they can be submitted, Practice Direction 12, but generally speaking, they are ignored. But nevertheless, we, together with an organisation called ELNET, European Leadership Network, did make a submission which did address a number of the points that we've been discussing in the course of this webinar. I would encourage everyone to read it. It can be accessed from our website. It can also be picked up in the building of the International Court of Justice. Apparently, states are told exactly where they can find these submissions, and there are a few other ones there. I think there may be also some from pro-Palestinian NGOs as well. But it wouldn't be correct to say that there has been no attempt by supporters of Israel or people sympathetic to Israel to try and address the monumental inaccuracies in some of the material that is being invoked.
No, that's absolutely. We certainly, with Fiji, tried in a 30-minute presentation to push back against some of these things, and we included a footnote reference to UKLFI's excellent paper. So there is material that's gone into the court. I think Hungary did a good job as well, UK. But yeah, in terms of pushing back against the legal and factual narrative, you're right. The court's getting a very one-sided perspective. Sylvia, one more question, I think, before we draw to a close.
Sure. So considering the Palestinian stated stance at the ICJ on this occasion is that the entire land belongs to the Palestinians, from the river to the sea, that Israel has no right to exist, whilst they're also calling for the global demand that Israel end its occupation. What do you feel the ICJ will make of this stance? Where does this leave the sovereign state of Israel? And also, I would add, if I may, what do you think will happen now?
The ICJ is going to rule against Israel on both the questions that Andrew read. The ICJ will rule that Israel is denying Palestinian rights of self-determination. They'll rule that the length of the occupation, now approaching 60 years, is in and of itself ipso facto violative of international law. They will rule that Israel's activities in Jerusalem, it's changing the demographic character of Jerusalem, violates international law, violates Palestinian rights of self-determination. And as regarding the second question, what are the consequences for all states? I think the fear that I have is that the court will say that the UN should consider whether Israel's status as a member state should be suspended or even revoked. I think that that's possible from the court. We'll have to see. Or even if the court doesn't say that, the General Assembly may move in that direction. I think that there is also going to be some language about boycotting, divesting, sanctioning, endorsing BDS sorts of principles. That may be in the opinion, or it may be, again, something that occurs as a result of the opinion. Regardless, the opinion will serve to supercharge protests around the world, campus activity that we have here in the US and in Europe, all anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and fundamentally, therefore, the opinion will do nothing to advance the cause of peace. It will do nothing to advance the prospects for Palestinian statehood. And that's the great irony here. Despite the reliance on the court, on the legal process, which the Palestinians have reverted to after Oslo, the only path forward for them to statehood is through negotiation.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to draw to a close. Thank you so much, both of our wonderful guests, Jonathan Turner from UKLFI in the UK, for Professor Steve Zipperstein from UCLA in California. Thank you, Sylvia, for your moderation. Thank you for watching, and please do join us next time in the next webinar. We're on every fourth Tuesday of the month, and we'll be doing other ad hoc webinars in between as events unfold. There's a lot happening, so keep in touch, keep informed, visit our websites, sign up for our e-bulletin if you have not done so, and please support our work financially. We need your support to be able to research these issues, to be able to educate people about them, and to be able to advise politicians, members of parliaments around the world on these complex issues. So thank you for your attention, and we will see you next time. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night.